It had been years since I last set foot in that house, the house I once called home. But today, as I stood at the rusted gate, a chill crept up my spine. The wind howled through the trees, the branches swaying like skeletal hands reaching out to grab me. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if this was the right thing to do. But something pulled me in, like an invisible force. Maybe it was the memories, or maybe it was something deeper. Something I had buried for too long. I pushed the gate open. The sound of it creaking echoed through the empty yard. The grass had overtaken the path, and the once vibrant flowers my mother had lovingly tended were now nothing more than tangled weeds. The house stood before me, its windows dark and hollow, as though it were waiting for me to return. I could feel it. The house hadn't forgotten. But I had. Or at least, I had tried to. I walked up the porch steps, each one creaking under my weight, and paused at the front door. It was locked, but the key was always hidden under the flower pot. I reached for it. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and for a split second, I wondered if someone else had been here, if the house had been disturbed. But no. There was only silence. The key turned in the lock with an eerie click. The door opened with a slow groan, as if it had been holding its breath. A musty smell filled the air, thick with dust and time. I stepped inside, and immediately, the memories flooded back. The familiar wooden floors, the wallpaper that had started to peel at the edges, the old grandfather clock that still ticked in the corner. Everything was the same, but nothing felt the same. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for me. I tried to shake off the unease, reminding myself that I had come here to close a chapter of my life I had long ignored. But the further I ventured into the house, the more I realized something wasn't right. The air felt heavier, colder. The walls seemed to close in, and the silence, once comforting, now felt oppressive. As I reached the living room, my gaze fell on the old family portrait hanging above the fireplace. It had always been there. A picture of us, my mother, father, and me. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at it. My mother's smile, frozen in time, looked so warm, so full of life. But then my eyes lingered on her eyes. They looked sad, almost as if they knew something I didn't. Suddenly I heard it, a faint whisper. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the longer I stood there, the clearer the whisper became. It was a voice, a soft, familiar voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it was as if the house itself was speaking to me. I turned around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. The room was empty. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The house had always been a place full of memories, both good and bad. I moved on, heading toward the stairs that led to the upper floor. As I ascended, the stairs creaked beneath me, each step a reminder of the years that had passed. I paused at the top, standing at the threshold of the hallway that once led to my childhood bedroom. The door was ajar. I didn't remember leaving it open. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. The air felt colder here, almost as if someone was standing in the room. I took a step forward, and then another. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, each step taking me closer to something I wasn't ready for. I reached the door. The room was dark, except for the faint light filtering through the dusty curtains. The bed, the dresser, the desk, all of it was just as I remembered. But there, in the corner of the room, was something that shouldn't have been there. A figure. A silhouette standing still, facing the wall. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure turned. I gasped. The face was familiar. It was her. My mother. Her eyes, wide and hollow, stared back at me, but there was something wrong, something unnatural. The room grew colder, the air thick with an unspoken tension. And then, without a word, she vanished. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Was I losing my mind? Had grief finally driven me to madness? Or was there something else, something darker in this house? The whispers returned, louder now, and I realized they weren't just voices. They were calls from the past, from a time when everything was normal, when I could still feel my mother's love and warmth. But I couldn't ignore the fear that was building inside me. The fear that the house was hiding something I wasn't ready to face. I turned to leave the room, but as I did, I heard it again. Louder this time. My name, spoken softly, from behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The silence was suffocating. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. Something wasn't right. Something had been waiting for me all these years, and now, it was finally ready to be revealed. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. As I stepped back into the hallway, I heard the sound again. The soft creak of a door opening. From downstairs. I hesitated, my feet frozen to the spot. The door downstairs, the front door, hadn't been open when I arrived. I was sure of it. My pulse raced as I slowly turned and began walking down the stairs, each step a hollow sound in the heavy silence. The house felt alive, as though the walls were closing in around me, whispering secrets I wasn't ready to know. The dim light from the hallway stretched across the stairs, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch towards me. I reached the bottom, and for a moment, I simply stood there, listening. The sound had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. I could almost feel the house holding its breath, waiting for me to move. The living room was just ahead. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the darkened space. It was eerily quiet. No whispers, no footsteps, just the faint ticking of the old clock in the corner. I walked into the room, half expecting to see something move, something out of place. But there was nothing. That's when I noticed it. A small object lying on the floor by the fireplace. I had been in this room before, but I didn't remember seeing it. I bent down, my hands trembling as I reached for it. It was a photo, crinkled at the edges, the colors faded with age. I turned it over, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of my mother, but there was something odd about it. She wasn't alone. A man stood next to her, someone I didn't recognize. I had never seen him before in any other pictures. The image sent a shiver through me. My mother had always kept her past so carefully hidden, never speaking about her life before me or my father. I'd always assumed it was just the way she was, protective, secretive. But this man in the photo, someone I had never heard of, had to mean something. Why was he here? Why hadn't I ever seen him before? I felt a strange pull to the photo, as if it was leading me somewhere. The whispers started again, this time more distinct. It was my mother's voice. "Come find me," she said, but the words sounded distant, muffled by the walls of time. "Come find the truth." I looked around the room, and that's when I saw it. The door to the basement, cracked slightly open. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed so obvious. It had always been locked, or at least it was supposed to be. The key had been lost long ago, or so I thought. I walked toward it, my steps slow, heavy with uncertainty. The darkness seemed to reach out from the basement, pulling me closer. I hesitated for just a moment, wondering if I should turn back. But the whispers grew louder, urging me on. I reached for the door and pushed it open. The creaking of the hinges echoed in the stillness, a sound too loud for such a small movement. Inside, the basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air damp and stale. The faint light from the hallway barely touched the edges of the darkness below. I stepped down, one foot after the other, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. With each step, the feeling of dread grew stronger. The smell down here was thick, like mildew, but also something else. Something older. I reached the bottom. The room was full of old boxes and forgotten things, discarded furniture, stacks of papers, and a single dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. My eyes scanned the room, trying to make sense of what was around me. And then, my gaze landed on something in the corner. It was a small wooden chest, covered in dust. The lock on it was old, rusted, but it still held. I walked toward it, my hands shaking as I reached for the chest. There was something inside it. I could feel it. Something I had been searching for. Something the house had been hiding from me. As my fingers brushed the lock, the whispers returned, louder than ever, now mixed with soft sobbing. It was my mother. I could hear her clearly now, her voice broken, full of pain. "Please," she whispered. "Open it. You have to know." I didn't want to. I didn't want to know what was inside that chest, but the pull was too strong. I had to. Slowly, I fumbled with the lock, the metal cold against my skin. Finally, it clicked open. The lid creaked as I lifted it, revealing what lay inside. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. There was a pile of old clothes, some papers, and then a small wooden box, carved with strange symbols. I reached for it, my hands trembling as I touched it. The moment my fingers made contact with the box, the house seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and a low guttural sound filled the air, almost like a growl. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. A heavy silence fell over the room, and then I heard it. Soft footsteps from behind me. I turned, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive darkness, the shadows stretching longer, as if the room itself was alive. I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cold. Ice cold. I froze. The air around me thickened, and the whispers started again. But now, they weren't just whispers. They were screams. Screams of pain, of agony. I knew the voice. It was my mother's. And then, the truth hit me like a thunderclap. The man in the photo wasn't a stranger. He was my father's brother, my uncle, and my mother. She hadn't died by accident. She had been taken. Taken by something in the house. Something she had tried to escape from. Something that had been waiting for me all this time. The chest. The box. The key. They were all part of a ritual that had never truly ended. And now, it was too late. The house was awake, and it wasn't letting me leave. Not this time. I could feel the weight of the room shift, the air pressing against me like a physical force. The whispers turned to frantic, unintelligible words, as if the house itself was trying to communicate. My heart raced as I stumbled backward, the box still clutched in my hands. The darkness around me seemed to close in tighter, the shadows bending and twisting in unnatural ways. It was as if the walls of the house had a life of their own, suffocating, pulling me in. I tried to take a step forward, but something stopped me. A force that wasn't visible but felt as real as the cold creeping through my skin. My breath came in short gasps as I stood frozen, my eyes wide. desperately searching for an escape. The basement door had vanished. I looked around again, but the familiar basement was no longer there. I was trapped in some kind of other space. A liminal place between worlds, where time and reality felt like they were slipping away. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even more, and I could see my breath, misting in the cold air. Then, the lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. The chest began to shake violently in my hands, and the box inside it started to hum, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly. I knew, without a doubt, that opening it had been a mistake, but there was no going back now. A voice broke through the chaos, a voice I recognized, though it was strained, distant. "You should have never come back," it said, barely a whisper, yet it echoed through the room like thunder. My mother's voice. I looked up, my eyes desperately scanning the now twisted version of the basement. The walls were no longer just walls. They were alive, pulsating, as if breathing. The shadows moved, and in the dark corners of the room, I saw faces. Faces of people I didn't know, twisted and contorted in agony, their eyes wide open and staring at me. Their mouths were open, but no sound came out. Just silent. It was suffocating. And then, I saw her. My mother. She stood at the far end of the room, but she wasn't the same. Her figure was distorted, her face hollow and gaunt, her eyes black pits that swallowed everything in their gaze. She looked at me, but there was no recognition in her expression. No warmth, no love, just emptiness. "Why didn't you save me?" Her voice echoed, the words slicing through the air like a blade. "Why did you leave me here to suffer?" I felt my knees weaken, my body trembling. The memories, everything I thought I had buried, came rushing back. My mother's death, the pain I never processed, the guilt that had haunted me for years. I thought I had left all that behind. I thought I could move on. But I was wrong. "You weren't supposed to know," she continued, her voice now a haunting low growl. "This house was never just a house. It was a prison. A prison for us all. And now you've released it." The words crashed over me like a tidal wave, drowning me in fear and regret. It wasn't just my mother's spirit that had been trapped here. The house, the land, everything was bound to something ancient and dark. And I had opened the door to it. The shadows in the room grew darker, swirling around me like a storm, and I realized, too late, that I had made a grave mistake. My mother's spirit wasn't the only one that had been trapped. There were others, countless others, trapped in this place, bound to the house by something more sinister than I could have ever imagined. And now, it wanted me too. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, like I was wading through water. The darkness reached for me, cold and relentless, pulling me back toward the center of the room. My breath quickened as I struggled against it, but it was no use. I couldn't move. The house had me in its grip. Suddenly, I felt a sharp, icy pain in my chest. My hand instinctively flew to the spot where the pain had struck, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible. But it was real. The pain was real. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. They weren't just words anymore. They were commands. "Stay with us," they hissed. "Join us. Become one of us." I closed my eyes, my chest tightening as the air around me thickened, suffocating me. And then, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned, heart hammering in my chest. It was her again. My mother. But this time, there was no sorrow in her expression, no pleading. Her face was blank, empty of emotion. She stepped closer, and her cold hand reached for mine. "Come," she whispered, her voice eerily calm. "Come with me. There's nothing left for you here." I wanted to pull away, to fight, but the grip of the house was too strong. My hand, against my will, reached out toward hers. The moment my fingers brushed hers, a sharp, overwhelming force shot through me. And I saw it. The truth. The house. The ritual. The box. Everything had been a trap. My mother hadn't died to escape the house. She had died because she was a part of it. A part of something far darker than I could ever have imagined. And as I looked into her hollow eyes, I understood. The house was alive. It wasn't just a building. It was a force, a parasite that fed off the pain, the fear, and the guilt of those who entered. And now, I was its prey. In that moment, the walls closed in on me, and I realized there would be no escape. The house had claimed me, just as it had claimed her. And the whispers filled my ears once again, their message clear. You will never leave. And in the silence that followed, I knew it was true. The air in the basement had turned thick, almost viscous, as though the very atmosphere was filled with something alive, something that wanted to devour me. I could no longer feel my limbs. My body felt weightless, suspended in time. Every movement, every breath seemed to drain the life from me, as if the house itself was feeding off my fear. My mind was clouded, my thoughts slipping away like water through my fingers. All I could focus on were her eyes, those hollow, black pits that stared into me, offering nothing but emptiness. But just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, I heard something. A sound, faint but distinct, like a whisper in the dark. It wasn't my mother's voice this time. It was different, more desperate. It called my name, faint at first, but then louder, insistent. "Help me." The voice trembled, breaking through the fog in my mind. "Please." It was familiar, the voice of a child, a soft, pleading voice. And suddenly, I remembered. My younger sister. I hadn't thought about her in years, not since the accident. "Emily?" My voice cracked as I whispered the name, barely able to form the words. The figure in front of me, my mother's twisted reflection, suddenly blinked, the darkness of her eyes shifting. Her grip tightened around my hand, pulling me closer. "You don't need her," she murmured, her voice becoming a low hiss. "She's gone. They're all gone. You can't save anyone." But the voice, Emily's voice, kept calling. Louder now, desperate, almost pleading. I could feel the pull, an undeniable force drawing me away from my mother's icy grip. My head spun, the room around me twisting and warping, the shadows now taking on shapes, figures moving in and out of the darkness, shifting like distorted reflections in a broken mirror. "Emily," I whispered again, more urgently this time. I had to find her. I had to know what happened, what the house had done to her. To all of us, I broke free. It was like breaking through a barrier, as though a veil had lifted. The cold hand that had been holding me released, and I stumbled forward. The shadows seemed to grow angry, reaching out to pull me back into their suffocating embrace. But I kept moving, following the sound of Emily's voice. I made my way through the darkness, my breath ragged, the room shifting with each step. The basement seemed to stretch before me, but the voice, the sound of Emily's cries, led me forward, pulling me deeper into the unknown. Finally, I reached the far corner of the room. There, hidden behind a pile of broken furniture and dust-covered boxes, I saw her. She was kneeling, her small frame hunched over her back to me. She was just as I remembered, her dark hair falling over her face, her small hands clutching at something, trembling. "Emily," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "It's me. It's okay. I'm here." She didn't respond, not at first. But then slowly, she turned. Her eyes, once full of life, were now empty. Just like my mother's. Hollow. Black. And I understood. My heart sank as I realized what had happened. The house hadn't just taken my mother. It had taken her too. Emily's spirit was trapped here, just like the others. The house had consumed her, just as it had consumed everything and everyone else. I reached out to her. But as I did, something shifted. The room began to twist violently, the walls bending inwards, collapsing. The light from above flickered, and then went out completely, leaving me in total darkness. The temperature plummeted, the cold seeping into my bones, freezing me where I stood. "You shouldn't have come," Emily's voice echoed, distorted, as though spoken by 1,000 voices at once. The shadows, now alive, surged forward, wrapping around me like tendrils, their grip tightening with every passing second. I stumbled backward, panic flooding my chest. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The walls pressed in tighter, suffocating me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Emily's face, her empty, lifeless eyes staring at me. And then, nothing. When I awoke, I was back in the house. The basement was gone. The cold, the shadows, the whispers. They were all gone. It was as if nothing had ever happened. The house, once alive with malevolent energy, now felt empty, silent. But I knew better. The house had claimed me. It had taken my mother, my sister, and now, me. I was trapped, just like them. I stumbled to my feet, my body aching as if I had been dragged through an endless night. I tried to leave, to escape, but the door wouldn't open. It never did. I was part of the house now, part of its twisted story. And then, just as I was about to lose all hope, I heard the whispers again. They weren't distant this time. They were inside my head, filling my mind with words I couldn't escape. "You're not alone anymore." The house had made its choice. I was its new prisoner, destined to roam its empty halls for eternity, just another lost soul in its dark, endless story. And now, I understood. There would be no escape, not for me, not for anyone. The house was alive, and it always would be.